The sky over Okinawa, May 1945, was the color of ash. Below, the island burned, smoke rising from shattered ridges where once the Japanese army had vowed to fight to the last man. From the east came a sound the defenders had learned to fear. The deep, thunderous whine of F4U Corsairs, the American carrier fighters known to the Japanese as whistling death. Flying low, their gull-shaped wings caught the sunlight like blades. Beneath each wing hung silver canisters, not bombs, but something far worse. The pilots of VMF 222 and VF 84, hardened by months of island warfare, rolled into attack formation. A single word crackled over the radio: fire. When the canisters fell, the jungle erupted. Flame rolled across the hills like a living thing, swallowing bunkers, trenches, and the screams of men trapped inside. Steel melted. Air turned to fire. The defenders who survived called it hell falling from the sky. For the first time, even the most loyal among them understood. This was not a battle for honor anymore. It was the end. Scripts. In 1940, as Europe burned and America watched from across the Atlantic, engineers at Vought Aircraft in Connecticut were working on a machine unlike anything that had ever flown before. It was sleek, fast, and powerful, a fighter that would crush anything Japan or Germany could put in the air. They called it the F4U Corsair. Its design was radical: an inverted gull wing, a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, and a huge 13-foot propeller that demanded the wings bend down and then up just to clear the ground. It could climb faster, fly higher, and hit harder than any naval fighter before it. When test pilot Boone Guyton first took the prototype aloft in May 1940, the plane screamed through the sky at over 400 miles per hour, faster than any fighter in the world. The engineers cheered. The Navy frowned, because the Corsair was too fast, too heavy, too wild. When it tried to land on a carrier, it bounced, veered, and smashed its tail hook like a hammer on steel. For carrier crews, it was a nightmare. For the pilots, it was a promise. If they could tame it, no enemy could stand against it. At first, the U.S. Navy rejected the Corsair for carrier service. It was handed instead to the U.S. Marine Corps, who were desperate for anything that could reach the outer islands of Japan's defensive ring. By 1943, squadrons like VMF 124 and VMF 214, the Black Sheep, led by Major Gregory "Pappy" Boynton, began flying the Corsair from rough coral airstrips in the Solomons and the Gilberts. The Japanese pilots, once masters of the Pacific skies in their agile A6M0s, suddenly found themselves hunted. The Corsair dove faster, hit harder, and climbed higher. Its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns tore through aircraft, fuel tanks, and steel with equal ease. When the first Japanese survivors reported back to their bases, they spoke of a plane that came from nowhere, struck like thunder, and vanished before they could react. They called it whistling death, named for the eerie howl of air rushing through its engine vents. It was more than a nickname. It was a warning. The Corsair demanded skill, and it punished mistakes. On takeoff, its massive torque could flip the aircraft if the pilot wasn't ready. On landing, one wrong move meant disaster. When test pilot Boone Guyton first took the prototype aloft in May 1940, the plane screamed through the sky at over 400 miles per hour, faster than any fighter in the world. The engineers cheered. The Navy frowned, because the Corsair was too fast, too heavy, too wild. When it tried to land on a carrier, it bounced, veered, and smashed its tail hook like a hammer on steel. For carrier crews, it was a nightmare. For the pilots, it was a promise. If they could tame it, no enemy could stand against it. At first, the U.S. Navy rejected the Corsair for carrier service. It was handed instead to the U.S. Marine Corps, who were desperate for anything that could reach the outer islands of Japan's defensive ring. By 1943, squadrons like VMF 124 and VMF 214, the Black Sheep, led by Major Gregory "Pappy" Boynton, began flying the Corsair from rough coral airstrips in the Solomons and the Gilberts. The Japanese pilots, once masters of the Pacific skies in their agile A6M0s, suddenly found themselves hunted. The Corsair dove faster, hit harder, and climbed higher. Its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns tore through aircraft, fuel tanks, and steel with equal ease. When the first Japanese survivors reported back to their bases, they spoke of a plane that came from nowhere, struck like thunder, and vanished before they could react. They called it Whistling Death, named for the eerie howl of air rushing through its engine vents. It was more than a nickname. It was a warning. The Corsair demanded skill, and it punished mistakes. On takeoff, its massive torque could flip the aircraft if the pilot wasn't ready. On landing, one wrong move meant disaster. The pilots who dropped it called it liquid fire. The soldiers who saw it called it the devil's weapon. By late 1944, the Corsair was striking deep into the heart of Japan's island defenses. At Polilliu, Marines called for napalm strikes to burn out caves filled with entrenched Japanese troops. At Iwo Jima, Corsairs from VMF 124 and VMF 213 flew hundreds of sorties before the first Marines ever landed. And, at Okinawa, the weapon reached its most terrible form. There, Corsairs flew in waves of 12, dropping napalm on Shuri Castle, the heart of the Japanese command network. The flames burned so hot that they cracked stone walls and warped steel. Survivors later described the bunkers collapsing inward as the air itself caught fire. For many Japanese soldiers, there was no escape. Their courage was real, their devotion unquestioned. But against napalm, against the sun brought down to earth, there was no defense. American pilots were haunted by what they saw. They could smell the burning fuel even at altitude. The fires they unleashed turned the night into a red horizon that never went dark. Some pilots cheered. Others fell silent. "We didn't celebrate," one Marine pilot later said. "You don't cheer for fire. You just watch it burn." And so, the F4U Corsair, once rejected, doubted, and feared, became the very symbol of American air power in the Pacific. A machine that combined beauty and terror, speed and destruction. It was the blade that cut the Empire's last breath from the Pacific wind. September 15th, 1944, Polilliu Island, Western Pacific. The morning sun rose red behind Mount Yamurbergal, staining the coral ridges like blood. In the tunnels carved deep into the limestone, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commander of the Japanese 14th Infantry Division's 2nd Battalion, stood beside a flickering acetylene lamp, listening to the distant hum that had haunted his men for weeks. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't the steady drone of B-24s they had grown used to. This sound was deeper, like thunder trapped in metal wings. The F4U Corsairs were coming. When the first flight appeared over the horizon, Marine Fighter Squadron 214, the Black Sheep, the defenders didn't yet understand what awaited them. Nakagawa's forward observers reported aircraft sweeping in low, their gull wings flashing in the sunlight. The men had seen American bombers before, but this was different. The Corsairs came alone, fast, silent until the last second. Then the sky tore apart. From the bunkers, Sergeant Yoshio Taniguchi saw the jungle erupt. The ground itself caught fire, he would later tell a war correspondent before vanishing in the Okinawa campaign. It wasn't bombing. It was like the air turned to flame. The Americans called it Napalm B, a new incendiary mixture of gasoline and aluminum salts. The Japanese called it Oni no Aim, the demon's rain. Taniguchi's bunker shook as liquid fire cascaded down the hillside, seeping into crevices, rolling like molten lava. Steel shutters on the gun ports began to glow red. Men clawed at the air, their rifles melting in their hands. A Type 96 light machine gun, its barrel still loaded, drooped like wax. The fire didn't just burn. It suffocated, sucking the oxygen from every corner of the caves. Nakagawa's sappers had spent months preparing the defense, an intricate warren of tunnels and kill zones designed to trap invading Marines. But the Corsairs turned fortifications into ovens. Each pass of the gull-winged fighters left rivers of fire in the coral valleys. The napalm didn't discriminate. It poured into trenches, detonated ammunition bunkers, and consumed entire platoons who never fired a shot. On the island's north ridge, Corporal Tadashi Wada of the 15th Independent Engineers tried to signal headquarters through a field radio, but static filled the line. The aerial bombardment had melted the transmission cables. By noon, Iwata's unit, once 128 men strong, was reduced to 17. He wrote a note in his field log before nightfall. The sky burns without mercy. The enemy's planes scream like devils. We were told death would come by the sword, not fire. But this is the end of the world. Outside, the Corsairs circled again. Marine pilots like Captain Kenneth Walsh, Medal of Honor recipient from the Solomons campaign, had learned that napalm did what bombs could not. It reached deep into caves and destroyed what was hidden. His after-action report from Poliliu read simply: Target, cave systems. Weapon, 150-gallon napalm tanks. Effect, total. By dusk, Poliliu's ridges glowed with embers. The Japanese 14th Division was effectively blind. Smoke choked the cave mouths, and the night sky shimmered orange. But still, the defenders did not surrender. They dragged the wounded deeper into tunnels, whispering the Emperor's name. Every survivor carried burns, not from shrapnel, but from the air itself. Colonel Nakagawa stood at the command post, the heat warping the walls, and told his adjutant, "If this is the power of the American devil, then Japan must fight on until we burn the seas themselves." The next morning, Corsairs returned, this time escorted by TBF Avengers carrying more napalm. From above, the island looked like a cracked ember floating in blue water. From below, it was hell itself. The Battle of Poliliu would last 73 days. When it ended, of the 10,900 Japanese defenders, 10,695 were dead. Most had never even seen an American face. They died in the fire that rained from the sky. The deck of the USS Bunker Hill, CV-17, trembled as the engines roared to life. It was dawn, September 1944. Lieutenant William Bill Moseley of Marine Fighter Squadron 222, VMF 222, climbed into his F4U Corsair, the blue-gray paint on its fuselage dulled by salt and heat. His call sign, Blue Devil 2. His mission, to turn the ridges of Poliliu into fire. Fuel tanks full, napalm loaded, the crew chief shouted through the whine. Each Corsair carried two 150-gallon napalm tanks, smooth metal canisters slung beneath the wings, filled with a gelatinous mix of gasoline and aluminum soaps that clung to everything it touched. It was still new, still experimental. Few pilots had seen it used up close. When a launch signal flashed, Moseley's Corsair catapulted forward, wings slicing through sea spray. The fighter lurched into the morning air, its Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine howling with 2,000 horsepower. Behind him, 12 more Corsairs followed, forming a wide V as they banked toward the black line of Poliliu's coast. Corsair Squadron, this is Devil One. Watch your spacing and don't drop early. We're painting the ridges red today. At 8,000 feet, the island came into view. The coral beaches were littered with wreckage. Shattered Japanese Type 95 tanks, broken anti-aircraft emplacements, and the faint orange shimmer of fires that had never gone out. Over the radio, one of the pilots murmured, "God, it's like flying over Mars." Moseley tightened his grip on the stick. Below, Marines from the 1st Division were pinned down by machine gun fire pouring from caves. The Corsairs' mission was simple: clear the ridges. But nothing about Poliliu was simple. The terrain was a maze of limestone, coral, and steel bunkers invisible from the air. "Blue Devil Flight, on me," Moseley said. "Let's light it up." The first run began at 2,000 feet. Moseley armed the release toggles, lining up his target, a trench line stretching across the northern slope. As he dove, the wind screamed through the cockpit. The gauges rattled. He hit the switch. 2 silver canisters dropped, and the world below erupted. A wall of orange fire rolled through the jungle. It moved like liquid, crawling over rocks, climbing trees, and spilling into openings in the ridge. Even from the cockpit, Moseley could see the shockwave flatten palm trees. The napalm stuck to everything: trenches, barrels, and men who never had a chance to run. "Direct hit," his wingman shouted. "Target's gone." The Corsairs banked hard and climbed again, their wings shimmering from the heat. Behind them, smoke pillars twisted into the sky, thick and black, visible for miles across the Pacific. The radio, filled with chatter, calls from the ground, requests for strikes, and then the flat, heavy voice of command. Keep it coming. They're not moving anymore. By noon, the temperature inside Mosley's cockpit topped 110 degrees. Sweat stung his eyes as he dove again, targeting a series of cave mouths identified by aerial photos. Each pass tore more of the island open. The explosions were deafening, but the silence afterward was worse. You could see them running. Another pilot, Lieutenant Robert Roche, later recalled in his mission diary. And then the fire caught them. I told myself not to look, but you always do. When the Corsairs returned to the carrier, their wings were blackened with soot. Crewmen in oil-stained uniforms moved quickly, reloading fuel and napalm. On deck, Mosley stepped down from his cockpit, helmet under his arm. His face was blank. "Did it work?" a young mechanic asked. "Yeah," Mosley said quietly. "Too well." The men knew napalm wasn't like any other weapon. Bombs destroyed, fire consumed, and yet, in the brutal arithmetic of the Pacific, it saved lives, American lives. The Marines could advance now, the bunkers silent, the jungle dead. That night, as Mosley sat in the dim, ready room, the mission log still open before him, he heard the sea pounding against the hull. He wrote one line in his notebook. "We don't fight men anymore. We fight ghosts inside the fire." Outside, the Corsairs slept on the deck, their wings folded like resting birds. But tomorrow at dawn, they would rise again. Okinawa, April 1945. The island was the final gate to Japan. 466 square miles of coral, mud, and misery. The Americans called it Operation Iceberg. The Japanese called it their final stand. From the decks of USS Essex, CV-9, and USS Bunker Hill, the air smelled of fuel and ocean salt. Hundreds of F4U Corsairs, belonging to VMF 312 checkerboards, VMF 323 death rattlers, and VF 84, lined up in perfect symmetry, their engines rumbling like chained beasts. At dawn, the carrier decks came alive. Crews shouted over the roar as napalm tanks, cylindrical and cold, were bolted beneath the Corsairs' wings. Mechanics wiped the red stenciling on their sides. 150 gallons napalm, Type B. The pilots knew what that meant. So did the enemy. Captain John Bolt, who had flown with the legendary Black Sheep Squadron under Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, now led his division in the first large-scale napalm assault of Okinawa. His orders: destroy the Japanese tunnel networks along Shuri Ridge. "They're buried in there," Bolt briefed. "You won't kill them with bullets. You'll burn the oxygen out." The Corsairs launched in formation, climbing into the clouds that rolled low and heavy over the Ryukyu Islands. Below them, U.S. Marines of the 6th Division were pinned down by hidden Type 92 machine guns and 75mm mountain artillery, buried deep in limestone caves. When the Corsairs appeared, the Marines ducked. They knew what was coming. Bolt's voice crackled over the radio. "Devil 1 to all aircraft. Let's light the hill." At 1,500 feet, they dove. The gull wings cut through mist. The canisters fell. And then the world turned orange. A curtain of fire swept across Shuri Ridge, swallowing gun pits, caves, and concrete pillboxes. The flames didn't explode. They flowed, rolling like waves across rock and dirt. The Corsairs came in line after line, blanketing the ridge in molten heat until nothing moved below. The Marines advanced hours later. They found rifles twisted into metal knots, helmets fused to skulls, and stone walls turned to glass. The smell lingered for days. Inside one of those caves, Major Hiromichi Ahara, the senior operations officer of the 32nd Army, crouched over a map smeared with ash. His uniform clung to his skin from the heat. The air was thick, impossible to breathe. His radio operator had fainted. Outside, napalm burned in sheets across the hillside. Yahara wrote in his journal that night, "The fire came from the sky, not as bombs, but as rivers. The men called it the crawling death. Our tunnels became our graves." By late April, over 12,000 Japanese soldiers had been incinerated or trapped underground. The rest dug deeper, clawing into the earth like burrowing ghosts. The F4U Corsair had become more than a plane. It was a symbol of inevitability, the mechanical angel of death that arrived each dawn, its engine echoing like thunder before the storm. Even Japanese Zero pilots, flying from Kyushu, began reporting low morale. One of them, Ensign Mr. Sato, wrote in his final letter home, "We cannot challenge what we cannot reach. Their planes breathe fire, and the fire eats the sky." By June 1945, over 1.5 million gallons of napalm had been dropped across Okinawa. Entire battalions were erased not by combat, but by suffocation and flame. The U.S. Navy's after-action reports praised the Corsairs' performance. The F4U proved the most effective fighter bomber in Pacific history. Napalm rendered entrenched resistance untenable. But the pilots rarely celebrated. They had seen what their weapons did. When Lieutenant Harold Spears of VMF 312 returned to the Essex after a 6-hour sortie, he removed his gloves and found his hands shaking. "It's not combat anymore," he said quietly to his crew chief. "It's cremation." When Okinawa finally fell on June 22, 1945, the Japanese army was gone, 77,000 soldiers dead, many by fire. The Corsairs had done their work. But in the black smoke rising from the island, both sides saw the same thing. A preview of what awaited Japan itself. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific had become a furnace. From the Solomons to Okinawa, entire islands had vanished beneath smoke and ash. To the men who fought beneath that fire, the F4U Corsair was no longer a machine. It was a prophecy of destruction. In the air over the Ryukyus, Colonel Bruce Porter of VMF 312 Checkerboards flew his Corsair on its 91st mission. His orders from the 5th Fleet's Task Force 58 were clear: continue incendiary operations. No mercy, no pause. Every sortie blurred into the next. Napalm over caves, strafing runs on convoys, rocket attacks on coastal defenses. The Corsair had evolved into the ultimate multi-role weapon. Fast enough to dogfight, rugged enough to absorb fire, and powerful enough to carry hell itself under its wings. The Navy's reports showed numbers, not faces. 97% of assigned targets neutralized. Average ground resistance reduced by 80% following napalm application. But among the pilots, there was no celebration. Lieutenant Bill Moseley, now on his 40th mission, wrote in his flight journal, "We used to fight soldiers. Now we fight shadows and screams." As the Corsairs cleared the last pockets on Okinawa, intelligence officers compiled what they called the fire effect. It noted that Japanese resistance crumbled fastest in areas hit by napalm, not because of casualties, but because fear itself spread faster than flame. Deep within a cave near Shuri, Major Hiromichi Yahara watched the sky turn white from fire. He was one of the few senior officers still alive. His troops, what remained of the 32nd Army, were starving, delirious, and terrified. Each morning began the same way. The distant whine of Corsairs, the ground trembling. Then silence, until the air itself burst into flame. Men began running before the first bomb fell. Yahara recorded. The smell of burning flesh had become part of the wind. Napalm stripped away the illusion of courage. It didn't just destroy, it erased the idea of hiding, of honor, of control. Even the most fanatical defenders, once devoted to dying in place, began to flee their bunkers in panic, only to be caught in the open. By June, Yahara's command had ceased to exist. His final report to Tokyo, sent through fragmented radio bursts, said, "Our soldiers no longer see the enemy. They only see fire." The lessons of the Corsairs' campaign spread quickly. Admiral Raymond Spruance's staff noted the efficiency of fire-based air assaults in breaking defensive morale. When word reached General Curtis LeMay of the U.S. Army Air Forces, he saw the future, not just for the Pacific Islands, but for Japan itself. From that realization came the March 1945 firebombing of Tokyo, where B-29 superfortresses dropped 1,665 tons of napalm and incendiaries in a single night. Over 100,000 people died as the city burned. It was the same principle the Corsairs had tested on Okinawa, magnified 1,000 times. Napalm had evolved from a tactical weapon to a psychological one, and it worked. Reports intercepted by American intelligence revealed that Japanese officers were calling the new weapon Hano no Seishin, the spirit of flame. They believed it to be unstoppable. By July 1945, even the once proud Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service had begun to unravel. Kamikaze pilots, facing the impossible task of breaching American naval firepower, wrote farewell notes that mentioned the Corsairs more than the flak guns. "Before we reach them, we must pass through the blue-winged demons," one pilot wrote. "They guard the sea with fire." The Corsair squadrons, rotating between the USS Bunker Hill, Essex, and Shangri-La, had become the constant presence of death over Japan's last outposts. No one was safe. Not infantry, not artillery crews, not even hidden bunkers carved into stone. For every Japanese unit that resisted, another was erased. Not by bombing runs or shell fire, but by the creeping, liquid inferno that came with dawn. When the last major battle ended at Okinawa, the Corsairs returned to their carriers streaked with soot and salt. The pilots said little. The war was nearly over, but none of them felt victory. They had seen what it took to win, and it was nothing human anymore. "We burned our way to peace," one Corsair mechanic would later tell a reporter in 1946. "And the smell of that peace will never leave me." June 1945, Okinawa had fallen. The smoke still curled from its hills when the last Corsairs lifted off, their wings blackened, their pilots hollow-eyed. The island was a graveyard now, 200,000 dead, soldiers and civilians alike. And though the guns finally went silent, the fire did not. It lingered in memory, in smell, in silence. On the deck of the USS Essex, Lieutenant Bill Moseley removed his helmet and stared at the black horizon. For the first time in months, there were no launch orders. The war was ending, or so they were told. Below deck, pilots from VMF 312 sat around the mess table, eating cold rations and saying nothing. Someone finally broke the silence. "Do you think they'll forgive us?" No one answered. Moseley opened his flight log, the same one he had carried since Peleliu. It listed 43 missions, 72 sorties, and 147 confirmed targets destroyed. He ran his hand down the final entry. Okinawa Ridge 12, Napalm strike. 14 minutes on target. He remembered the orange glow that followed the drop, the way the horizon itself seemed to melt. He'd told himself it was necessary. But in the quiet of the Pacific night, necessary didn't sound like enough. "We didn't just burn the enemy," he wrote later. "We burned pieces of ourselves." Across the ruined landscape of Okinawa, Major Hiromichi Ahara emerged from his bunker. He was one of the few officers still alive to surrender. The once mighty 32nd Army was gone. The tunnels were full of corpses, the air still thick with soot. When he was taken into American custody, a Marine interpreter asked him why he had not committed suicide like so many of his comrades. Yahara paused, then said, "Because someone must live to tell what fire does." He would later testify in Tokyo, describing how the new American weapons turned fortified ridges into crematoriums. He spoke not with hatred, but disbelief. It was as if the sun had fallen, he said. For the survivors, soldiers and civilians alike, fire had become the face of the war. Children who fled the Corsair raids would spend years dreaming of wings that screamed before the sky turned red. Even 1945, in villages across Kyushu, mothers warned their children, "When you hear thunder, hide. The Firebirds are coming." In July, the Corsairs were ordered north to join Task Force 38, preparing for the invasion of Japan itself. But the invasion never came. On August 6th, AB-29, named Enola Gay, dropped a new kind of fire over Hiroshima. 3 days later, another fell on Nagasaki. When the mushroom clouds rose, the Corsair pilots watched from hundreds of miles away, their radios silent. They knew, without being told, that the fire they had carried in their tanks had been reborn in the heart of a bomb. The war was over, But for those who had flown through the Pacific Inferno, peace felt indistinguishable from guilt. "We thought we were ending hell," wrote Captain John Bolt in his post-war diary. "We didn't realize we had taught the world how to build it." The F4U Corsair, once feared and hated, became an icon of American air power. It served again in Korea and even Vietnam, where, ironically, napalm once more burned across the jungles, just as it had on Peleliu. For the Japanese who survived, the Corsair remained a symbol not of defeat, but of awe, a reminder of how far human ingenuity could reach and how far it could fall. And for the pilots who flew her, there was a lesson etched into every mission log and every silent night after the war. Power wins wars, but fire changes the world forever. The Pacific is calm now. Waves roll softly over the same coral reefs that once burned red under the Corsair's wings. 70 years have passed since the whistling death screamed through these skies. Yet if you stand on the cliffs of Okinawa at sunset, you can still feel the ghosts moving in the wind. Beneath your feet lie the tunnels where Japanese soldiers made their last stand, their helmets fused by heat, their rifles buried in glass. Above, the clouds drift over what was once a sky of flame. The F4U Corsair, with its distinctive gull wings and roaring engine, became a symbol of victory, but also of transformation. It marked the moment when man learned to wield fire as a weapon, and in doing so, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. For the American pilots, victory came with a cost that words could never repay. For the Japanese defenders, the end came not from defeat, but from the sky itself, a fire they could not fight, only endure. When Major Hiromichi Ahara returned to Japan after the war, he visited a burned-out shrine and placed a note in the rubble. It read, "We fought with honor. We died in fire. May those who live remember what we learned too late." And that, perhaps, is what this story truly is. Not about glory, not about power, but about memory of how fragile humanity becomes when technology outpaces mercy. The F4U Corsair was built to end a war, and it did. But long after its engines went silent, its legacy lived on in every weapon born from fire. When we remember the men who flew her and those who faced her, we remember not just courage, but consequence. So when you see the blue silhouette of that gull-winged fighter in a museum or painted across the side of a model plane, don't just see a machine. See the hands that built it, the eyes that watched it descend from the clouds, and the fire that forever changed what it means to wage war. Because history isn't just written in victories. It's written in what we choose never to repeat. Remember the fire. Remember them all.